A flight attendant tried to intimidate a black CEO, but his twin brother calmly grabbed the lawsuit, and the entire cabin went silent. A flight attendant grabbed the black CEO by the neck, thinking no one would intervene. He didn't realize the CEO's twin brother was ready, and the lawsuit was already in his hand. Subscribe if you believe arrogance always collapses when true protection rises. Derek Morn's eyes locked on the man in seat 2. Like a targeting system acquiring a threat. It was subtle at first, just a flicker of tension, a longer than necessary pause as he passed the first row of Aravel Flight 702's forward cabin. But Cale Vernick noticed. He always did. The CEO of Valor Tech Systems hadn't built an empire by ignoring instincts, and this one, sharp and immediate, prickled beneath his skin like a low-voltage warning. "No drink." Derek's voice cut through the quiet boarding ambiance, his tone overly casual, yet laced with something less benign. The beverage cart hadn't even been rolled out yet. Cale looked up, calm. "No, thank you." Derek's lips barely moved. "Suit yourself." But the way he lingered, eyes narrowing just slightly, made it clear that wasn't the answer he wanted. Cale returned his focus to the encrypted briefcase resting against his leg. The matte black casing bore no logo, only a biometric seal near the handle. It contained the AI regulatory compliance specs that would soon shape 3 nations' aviation frameworks. Every line of code in that file had been vetted, redrafted, and triple-locked by Valor Tech's in-house legal and ethics board. It wasn't just confidential, it was volatile, in the way information becomes when it threatens outdated systems and powerful adversaries. The plane hadn't left the gate. The seatbelt sign wasn't even on. But already, Cale felt the air shifting. From the corner of his vision, he saw Derek checking something on his crew tablet, a longer-than-normal scroll, followed by an unmistakable sideways glance back toward him. Cale adjusted his posture without appearing tense. His eyes drifted to the other passengers, watching for any sign that this was more than a hostile flight attendant on a bad day. 2 rows back, an older man tapped idly on his phone. A young business executive across the aisle looked absorbed in his emails. No one else seemed to notice, but Cale did, and he knew this wasn't random. He reached into the inner pocket of his jacket, pressing once against the smooth edge of the voice-activated pen his brother Kalen had insisted he carry. "Always record before it becomes a memory," Kalen had said during their last call. Cale didn't consider himself paranoid, just prepared. Still, he hadn't expected trouble this early. Boarding was supposed to be the quiet part. This flight was routine, short, tactical. Sorenvale City in the next 2 hours, close the regulatory loop with the International Ethics Commission, and then back before midnight to toast Kalen's birthday. Nothing extravagant, just the way his brother liked it. 1 clean flight, 1 clean win. But nothing about this felt clean. Derek's footsteps returned, slower this time, almost dragging. He stopped by row 1, adjusted a luggage bin that didn't need adjusting, then casually glanced down. "You traveling alone today?" he asked, voice softer now, almost rehearsed. Cale blinked once. "Is that a passenger protocol question?" Derek smirked. "Just making conversation." Cale said nothing. It wasn't that he feared confrontation. Quite the opposite. But experience had taught him the value of silence, how stillness could speak louder than argument. He let the tension hang between them, then calmly opened a slim folder from his bag. The header read, "Tier 4, Compliance Algorithm, Final Audit Layer." Just reading it grounded him. Derek didn't move. Cale lifted his eyes again. "Something else I can help you with?" "Nope." Derek's smile vanished. He turned and walked off, but not before Cale noticed him tap something on his belt. A small black rectangle blinked red once, then dimmed. Cale's mind raced, but his face remained composed. That device wasn't standard. He'd seen its prototype 2 years ago in a research memo titled Behavioral Monitoring Subdivision, Flight Readiness Analysis Tools. The memo had been shelved. The program suspended indefinitely after Valor Tech exposed major ethical breaches. And yet, here it was, clipped to the waistband of a low-level crew member with a temper. He leaned back slowly, breathing evenly. The pen was still recording. Outside the cabin window, the tug vehicle had disengaged. The aircraft door was closing. Derek returned. This time, he didn't speak. He simply leaned in, too close, and stared at the buckle of Cale's seatbelt. "You didn't click it yet," he said flatly. Cale glanced down. It was fully fastened. "I'm good," Cale replied, voice steady. Derek didn't move. His fingers hovered near the clasp. Cale's hand slid to his lap, casual. His thumb brushed the top of the pen again. Recording. Still active. "I'll double-check," Derek said. Cale gave a small nod. "You've checked." The moment held. From behind them, a faint mechanical click signaled the final door seal. The intercom buzzed. "Flight attendants, prepare for departure." Derek didn't move. Cale's breath deepened. His thoughts weren't on fear. They were on evidence, process, pattern recognition. His eyes lifted to the cabin ceiling, to the exact spot he'd helped design 6 months earlier as part of Valor Tech's compliance upgrade for Aravel's newer jets. Just above row 3, a discrete dome housing a 3-angle fisheye lens. Full audio, video, time-stamped, redundantly backed up. Derek followed his gaze and smirked. Cale spoke then, quietly. "You're being recorded." Derek didn't reply, but his eyes said everything. Tension thickened like humidity in a sealed room, the kind that makes breath feel heavier. Cale's pulse stayed even. His training taught him that measured calm often weaponized the panic of others. He leaned back again, placing both hands visibly on his lap. Derek stared once more, then turned away. Cale glanced down at the pen in his pocket and whispered under his breath. He never thought he'd need it before takeoff. Derek's shadow loomed before Cale's seat without warning. The sudden halt of footsteps broke the hum of the settling cabin. Without introduction or apology, Derek Morn, the flight attendant, extended a hand with curt authority. "Identification," he demanded, eyes already scanning Cale's lap for signs of resistance. Cale looked up slowly, surprised but composed, and pulled his digital pass from the side of his jacket. He offered it calmly, fingers steady, voice even. "Here." Derek took the ID, but instead of a quick verification like with any routine passenger, he held it, too long. His eyes narrowed with a subtle squint, not reading, but sizing up. Cale watched him in silence, already noting how no other passengers were being subjected to this sudden inspection. Derek's lips curled, attempting a casual shrug. "No offense, just protocol," he muttered, though the emphasis on the word protocol carried an edge. Cale gave a respectful nod. "Understood." He turned his attention back to the data tablet on his lap, pretending to read, though the words blurred. Derek didn't move. He hovered a second too long, enough for the man seated behind Cale to glance up, puzzled. Cale's senses sharpened. He could feel the scrutiny, the performative stare, the intentional stillness. Derek wanted a reaction. Across the terminal, inside a private suite on the top floor of Valor Tech's Sornvale office, Kalen Vernick stared at a blinking status alert on his dashboard. His eyes darted to a biometric readout screen displaying Cale's ID ping, flagged by a third-party scanner. He froze. That access required credentials no one outside the airline or law enforcement should have. Kalen's fingers flew across the console. Within seconds, he was connected to Devin Marr, their legal operations consultant. "Devin, check the crew logs for Flight 702. I just got a biometric flag on Cale's ID. Third-party scanner." His voice was clipped, urgent. Devin was already typing. "Third party? No one should even have manifest access outside the gate. That's a compliance breach." "My thoughts exactly," Kalen replied. "Monitor everything. I don't like how this is starting. Back on the aircraft, the cabin lights dimmed slightly, preparing for pushback, but Derek wasn't done. He stepped forward again and leaned down toward Cale, voice quieter but more threatening. "I need you to switch seats," he said, eyes flicking to the aisle. "There's been a manifest misprint. You're supposed to be in 9C. Cale didn't flinch. "No, I'm in 2A, he replied, holding up the digital boarding pass on his screen. "It's confirmed." Derek exhaled sharply, lips tightening. "You're not listening. There's been a change." Cale raised an eyebrow. "Then why wasn't I notified at the gate, or during boarding, or by the captain?" The moment hung heavy. A few passengers nearby glanced over now, sensing that something abnormal was brewing. One man coughed softly, as if to break the tension. Derek's face began to flush and his voice sharpened. "I need you to move. Don't make this difficult." Kyle didn't raise his voice. Instead, he reached a hand into the inside lining of his coat and gently pressed the clip at the top of the pen nestled in his pocket. A gift from Kalen, disguised as an ordinary stylus but voice-activated, set to record with a 3-second delay. "I'm not making anything difficult," Cale said plainly. "I'm staying in my confirmed seat." Derek's stance stiffened. His knuckles whitened where he gripped the headrest. The calculated silence that followed was louder than any outburst. Every muscle in Cale's body was tense, not from fear, but from anticipation. This wasn't a random seat error. The hostility was deliberate, precise, and escalating. "Sir," Derek said again, this time more forcefully. "I said move, now." Cale didn't shift. His fingers, invisible to anyone else, drummed once against the base of the pen in his pocket, ensuring the recorder had picked up the command. This wasn't turbulence from altitude. This was turbulence from power, and it hadn't even left the ground. This flight's turbulence hadn't even left the ground. Just as the aircraft doors sealed with a hollow mechanical thud, Derek Morn emerged from the galley with a strange, predatory calm. He said nothing. No warning. No explanation. In a single, swift movement, he reached across Cale Vernick's row, unlatched the seatbelt with a harsh click, and grabbed the man by the collar, then his neck. Gasps erupted from passengers nearby. The noise was soft at first, like an intake of breath before a scream, but it spread across the cabin like electricity. Cale was yanked forward, the pressure on his windpipe sharp and sudden. Derek's grip tightened as he forced Cale to stand, dragging him one step toward the galley bulkhead. The violence was fast but not uncontrolled. It was deliberate, targeted. Derek's face twisted with something more than rage. There was calculation in it. Cale didn't resist. Not because he was weak, but because he was thinking. Reacting physically would only validate the story Derek wanted to tell. His right hand, steady and tight, remained close to his chest, clutching the fabric over his lapel where the voice-activated pen was clipped, still recording. Even in the choking grip of his attacker, Cale's mind stayed 3 steps ahead. He turned his head slightly, just enough to lock eyes with the small dome-shaped security camera above row 3. "Stop resisting," Derek shouted, voice raised loud enough to fill the cabin, trying to plant a false narrative in the minds of passengers. The phrase echoed with pretense, a classic manipulation, spoken more for the audio feed than for any reality. Cale stood still. The noise around them surged. Someone gasped again, someone fumbled with a phone. 2 passengers stood up instinctively, alarmed, one of them already reaching for a call button. Derek barked at them, voice sharp like a whip. "Sit down. Now." Both froze. One hesitated, then reluctantly sank back into his seat, palms raised as if surrendering to confusion. The cabin held its breath. Then came the interruption. From 3 rows back a man stood, quiet, composed, wearing a charcoal gray blazer and an ID badge clipped discreetly to his lapel. He had remained still through the earlier commotion, but not anymore. His voice was calm but carried the full weight of command. "Enough." The single word sliced through the noise with startling clarity. Derek turned, eyes narrowing. The man stepped forward, slow but firm. Bram Cortell, Civil Aviation Auditor, Federal Oversight Division. He pulled a slim wallet from his inner pocket and flipped it open, revealing a federal ID. "Release the passenger, now." Derek didn't move at first. His fingers remained curled around Cale's neck, hesitation dancing behind his eyes. There was a flicker of recognition. He knew the name, knew what it meant, but control was already slipping through his fingers. Cale, still silent, shifted his eyes to Derek's and spoke for the first time since the assault began. His voice was even, but the words dropped like iron. "You've made contact. That's federal assault." The words seemed to freeze the air. Passengers who had been too afraid to react before now leaned forward, as if sensing that something irreversible had just been said. Cortell didn't blink. He stepped closer, now directly beside Cale, holding his badge in one hand. And this plane just became evidence. Captain Marin Ryler emerged from the cockpit just as Derek Morn's hand lingered on Cale Vernick's shoulder, fingers tightening as if to reassert a last measure of dominance before being forced to retreat. The tension in the cabin had congealed into a heavy, almost physical force, the silence broken only by the hum of idling engines and the quiet clicks of phone cameras capturing what they hoped was enough. Ryler didn't hesitate. His boots echoed on the thin carpet as he strode forward, a line of strain visible between his brows. "Step back. Now," he commanded, his voice sharp, level, and unmistakably final. Derek recoiled a fraction but turned his head with practiced defiance. "He was provoking me," he muttered, his jaw set, tone thick with resentment. He withdrew his hand, but not without letting it drag just enough to make a point, as if his touch still owned the moment. The captain's glare sharpened. "Crew hold, now." Cale didn't move. His hands remained calmly at his sides, but the brief shudder of breath he released was measured, strategic. He didn't react to Derek's words or glance at the passengers who watched from the corner of their eyes. Instead, with deliberate precision, he reached into his inner jacket pocket, pulled out the voice-activated pen, and handed it to Bram Cortell, who stood behind Derek with arms crossed, his badge discreet but unmistakable beneath the fold of his blazer. "Keep this safe," Kyle said evenly. Bram nodded once, his gaze already scanning the device, understanding its significance. Captain Ryler motioned toward the back of the aircraft, and two junior attendants stepped up to escort Derek. He resisted just long enough to remind everyone that control was never something he relinquished quietly, then allowed himself to be walked back. His eyes, however, never left Cale. They held no apology, only calculation. "Ladies and gentlemen," came Ryler's voice over the intercom, "we are experiencing a brief delay due to an internal security review. Please remain in your seats with your belts fastened. We appreciate your cooperation." The captain replaced the receiver and turned toward Kyle. "This isn't over, sir, but you're not alone in this." It was more than professionalism. It was a quiet alignment, an acknowledgement of something much deeper now in motion. Meanwhile, in a quiet legal operations room hundreds of miles away, Calen Vernick sat before a wall of screens, his fingers flying across the keyboard as an alert pulsed in the top corner of the display. Vernick Cale, event flagged, severity red. He didn't hesitate. Lifting his phone, he called directly into Aravel's compliance legal channel and said the words that had never needed to be spoken until now. "This is Dr. Calen Vernick. Activate Clause 44. Preservation chain starts now. Lock all cabin feeds. Notify the Compliance Auditor General and begin sealed data replication." A stunned pause on the other end. "Sir, Clause 44 hasn't been triggered on a commercial route in." "I wrote it. Trigger it," Calen snapped, eyes already narrowing as he pulled up Derek Morn's credentials. "Tell your liaison, this isn't a warning. This is litigation prep." He ended the call and turned to Devin Marr, their legal consultant already dialing backup systems into motion. "The pen Cale carries is recording, And now, so is everything else. Back aboard Flight 702, Cale sat quietly in seat 2A, still buckled in, hands relaxed on his lap, but his mind sharp as a blade. Every word, every stare, every movement had been part of a plan, not because he wanted it, but because years of corporate resistance had taught him what might come. He tilted his head slightly toward Bram. That feed needs to be preserved. All of it. It's already being routed, Bram confirmed, and Captain Ryler has given me full witness authority. Cale gave a single nod. The atmosphere remained deceptively calm. A child nearby asked his father if the plane was broken. A teenager lowered his phone, thinking he'd caught enough, but none of them knew the deeper weight hanging in the cabin. Cale tapped his phone once and opened a secure line. Kalen. The response came immediately. I'm already in. Activate full clause authority. Begin legal chain. There was a short pause before Kalen replied. Already did it. You hold the evidence. I hold the leash. Derek Morn's face twitched with frustration as the aircraft remained parked on the tarmac. The cabin lights dimmed to a dull hum, and the hum of restless passengers filled the stale air. Outside, the runway shimmered under the afternoon glare, but inside, tension thickened like fog. Derek paced the narrow crew hold like a cornered animal, clutching his comm unit in one hand, whispering heatedly into a private line that kept cutting out. His free hand trembled, not from fear, but from panic. He knew things had spiraled too fast, too early. In the main cabin, passengers murmured, some discreetly filming with their phones, others nervously glancing at Cale Vernick, still composed in seat 2A. His fingers, however, weren't still. He tapped a sequence on the in-cabin armrest terminal, a custom override function he'd architected into the compliance module months earlier. Most passengers thought it was just a touchscreen menu. Cale knew better. Captain Marin Ryler's voice came in low over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we are experiencing a brief internal security delay. Please remain seated. It was calm, measured, but behind the cockpit door, Ryler was already on a secure line to ground control. Requesting cabin review authorization, he muttered, eyes flicking over the internal report sent by Bram Cortell. We may have a protocol breach on board. Across the city, in a soundproofed legal operations room, Kalen Vernick and his litigation analyst, Darvin Saul, pored over a live stream from the plane's internal feed. Suddenly, Darvin stiffened. Freeze frame right there, he said. Kalen leaned forward as the image stabilized. Derek was caught mid-stride in the crew hold, one arm bent as he adjusted something clipped under his uniform lapel. Zoomed in, the object was unmistakable. A square patch with 3 thin red lines running diagonally. Kalen's eyes narrowed. That's a BMU patch, he whispered. Darvin looked confused. Behavioral Monitoring Unit? I thought that program was shut down last fiscal quarter. Kalen's jaw clenched. Officially, yes. But that patch's sequence code was tagged for shadow units, reinstated off record by a shell subsidiary in Norwin. This isn't crew misconduct, it's tech warfare. He snapped open a secondary channel and called Cale directly. Back on the aircraft, Cale accepted the call through his smartwatch, shielding his mouth as he whispered, Go. They're testing a ghost protocol, Kalen replied, voice tight. Derek's not just rogue, he's equipped and illegal. Cale didn't flinch. He nodded slightly and ended the call. Without hesitation, he turned to Captain Ryler, who stood near the forward cabin entry, assessing the cabin like a battlefield commander. I need access to the terminal, Kyle said. Ryler hesitated, but something in Cale's voice carried weight. Not threat, authority. He nodded. 2 minutes. Use it clean. Cale stepped forward, passengers turning to watch. Fingers flew across the terminal. He bypassed the airline's internal restrictions, authenticated through a compliance signature embedded in his security badge, and deployed a locked module. Lines of encrypted code scrolled across the screen. Then a silent upload. From the terminal, a formal declaration beamed across the aircraft's internal network. Every crew tablet, every pilot panel, every security interface flashed a single message. Passenger Rights Protocol. 44A activated. This flight is now under active legal audit. Compliance engagement in effect. Terms acknowledged via pre-flight operations manifest. Evidence chain initiated. Ryler's eyes widened as he scanned the alert. He didn't stop it. At the same moment, deep within Valertech's backup buffer network, the cabin's live security feed forked, archiving a duplicate stream into a legal evidence silo Kalen controlled. The recording wasn't just footage. It was metadata tagged by Kale's encryption layers, time-stamped, passenger location indexed, and crew movement tracked frame by frame. Derek still had no idea. He slammed his comm unit shut, pacing harder now, glancing toward the curtain separating the galley. Sweat glistened near his temple. The private line hadn't gone through. Whatever backup he expected wasn't coming. In seat 2A, Kale sat down again, slowly. His face was calm, but in his hand he now held a secondary flash drive connected to the terminal. As the legal declaration finalized its upload, a subtle chime rang through the cabin, disguised as a seatbelt reminder. But on the back end, it signaled a complete lock on all digital crew communications. From this moment forward, nothing could be deleted. Nothing could be altered. Everything was preserved. Bram Cortell, sitting quietly 2 rows back, caught Kale's eye. He gave a subtle nod of confirmation. Kale returned it. The chain had begun. Meanwhile, Kalen was already typing the first of 5 preservation orders, each one addressed to a different authority: Federal Aviation Oversight, Transportation Ethics Committee, Cybersecurity Compliance Board, Passenger Rights Tribunal, and Valertech's own Board of Directors. Still seated, Kale exhaled quietly. The flight hadn't moved an inch, but the battle had already lifted off. He looked up toward the quiet cabin, now buzzing with whispered speculation. His voice was calm when he said, to no one in particular but loud enough for the nearest rows to hear, "From this moment forward, this flight is under active legal audit, terms you signed." He wasn't even on the roster this morning. The whisper struck Kale like a silent detonation. Kevin Vale, one of the senior attendants, stood beside him with an expression equal parts confusion and concern. His voice had dropped just low enough to avoid cabin microphones. "Derek was swapped in last minute," he repeated. "I saw the change myself, less than an hour before boarding." Kale turned toward him fully now, brows furrowed but jaw still steady. The pieces clicked. Derek hadn't just shown up by coincidence. This wasn't a scheduling error. It was precision, purpose, sabotage. Bram Cortell leaned in across the aisle, reading Kale's expression before hearing a word. "You want off the plane," Bram said quietly, not as a question but as confirmation. Kale nodded once. "Yes, let's take this off the plane before they can bury it." But the captain had already approached. Captain Marin Ryler's stance was rigid, but his voice was calm as a taut wire. "I don't advise deplaning," he said flatly, arms crossed. "If you leave now, they'll sweep it. Moment you walk off, it becomes a ground-level report. You fly, it becomes national footage." Kale looked from the captain to Bram, calculating. Not in fear, but in tactics. He didn't blink. "They want it mid-air," he muttered. "They're pushing for escalation. That's their play." Kalen's voice came through the earpiece next. "They want the incident to happen mid-air. They want escalation." His tone was measured but tense. "Stay on board. We'll make the case in the sky." A moment of silence passed between Kale and Bram. Then Kale exhaled once and returned to his seat. The captain nodded and turned back toward the cockpit. The plane began taxiing. Cabin lights dimmed to compliance standards. No further announcement was made. Passengers resumed murmured conversations. A few exchanged worried glances, but most seemed blissfully unaware of the trap they were flying into. One passenger closed his eyes with feigned disinterest. Another scrolled through his phone, oblivious to the legal hurricane forming beneath his aisle. Derek was confined in the crew hold, at least for now. Cale sat motionless, fingers resting atop his briefcase, but inside, gears were grinding. Every breath was measured, every movement deliberate. He activated the voice pen again, not because he needed new evidence, but because he understood the symbolism. This pen had already captured truth once. It would again. Meanwhile, back at Valor Tech's legal hub, Kalen had moved fast. 5 preservation orders were already logged and time-stamped. 3 were sent to Aravel's internal data storage teams. 1 went to the FAA's Ethics Division. The last was routed directly to their compliance cloud, triggering automatic server duplication for any mid-flight data streams originating from Flight 702. Then came the twist. Kalen's analyst paused on one frame of the live feed and zoomed in. A subtle patch on Derek's undershirt, nearly invisible, flickered beneath the edge of his uniform when he'd been confined earlier. Kalen squinted, then cursed under his breath. The patch was a coded transmitter used by an experimental crew division, the behavior monitoring subdivision. That program was supposed to be shuttered, disbanded due to backlash, canceled after leaked reports of targeted passenger manipulation. But this patch, this signal, meant only one thing. It had been quietly reactivated. "They're testing something illegal," Kalen said, turning toward the compliance investigator sitting across from him. Back on the aircraft, Cale signaled to the captain again. "I'd like terminal access," he said calmly. Captain Ryler, visibly torn but silently respectful, gave a single nod. 5 minutes. Do what you need to do." Inside the cockpit-adjacent terminal bay, Cale pulled up a secured relay point, one only he and Kalen had mapped during their compliance integration months ago. He typed quickly, bypassing the airline's standard interface. Within moments, he uploaded a pre-written legal declaration into the aircraft's internal system. Every crew terminal and onboard audit point would now carry a single embedded line of code linking to his message. Passengers wouldn't see it, but the airline's legal team would. So would regulators. He tapped Execute. The message loaded onto the internal flag server with a soft beep. "From this moment forward, this flight is under active legal audit. Terms you signed." Cale stood, turned back toward his seat, and walked the aisle in calm silence. Not a single word left his mouth. But the captain watched. Bram watched. And somewhere, behind the eyes of the quiet passengers pretending to sleep, a few caught the change in the air. It had begun. The trap was no longer on Kyle. It was around them all, and beneath the layers of quiet strategy, smothered tension, and the cold hum of altitude, a deeper truth settled in Cale's bones. This wasn't just personal. It was engineered. Someone had sent Derek with purpose, and they'd gambled it all on one simple mistake. They picked the wrong neck. The jolt of turbulence rattled the overhead compartments with a low groan, making a few passengers gasp and grip their armrests. Cale didn't flinch. His eyes remained fixed on the darkened cabin wall ahead, his mind steady despite the rhythmic hum of uncertainty. But then came the real jolt. Derek Morn. The crew hold door slammed open with force that made nearby passengers turn. Derek stumbled forward with a manic edge, eyes locked on Cale like a storm looking for a target. His uniform was rumpled, jaw tight, and something feral brewed behind his forced grin. He was not supposed to be out. Captain Ryler's previous order had been firm, but orders meant nothing to a man unraveling. "Sir, return to the crew hold," Ryler barked, emerging from the galley like a sentinel. He stepped directly into Derek's path, blocking the narrow aisle between business-class seats. "Another step, and I will land this plane." Derek paused. Then came a short, bitter laugh, the kind that tried to hide fear with false confidence. With a theatrical flick of his wrist, he tossed a folded paper toward Kyle. It landed squarely in Cale's lap. "You think your tech changes anything?" Derek sneered. Cale didn't speak. He slowly unfolded the slip. Inside was a grainy, blurred image of Kalen, his twin brother, stepping out of their firm's legal tower that morning. It wasn't just a picture. It was a message, a threat, proof someone was watching not just Cale, but his family. The air in Cale's lungs thinned, but his face didn't show it. Calm, controlled. His fingers folded the image again with care, then placed it under the lip of his tray table. He looked to Bram Cortell, seated across the aisle. "Contact the emergency contact on file," Cale said quietly but firmly. "Tell him it's time." Bram, already alert since Derek's reappearance, reached into his jacket without hesitation. He began dialing. Derek scoffed. "What? Calling your lawyers? You think a badge scares anyone at 30,000 feet?" Cale didn't respond. Instead, he reached into his carry-on with practiced precision and pulled out his laptop. No shaking hands. No rush. Just purpose. He flipped it open, the screen casting a soft glow on his composed expression. The hum of the engines pulsed behind the quiet tension in the cabin. The whistleblower portal was buried deep in the airline's internal system, accessible only with authorized clearance. Cale, as co-architect of the system's compliance framework, had those credentials memorized like poetry. It took him less than 2 minutes to breach the secure interface. Behind him, some passengers were watching closely now, their confusion turning into quiet curiosity. They knew something bigger was playing out, but didn't know how much of it was being recorded in that moment. Cale began typing a short, precise declaration. His fingers moved with deliberate care, each keystroke a stitch in a web of accountability. He attached the voice recording from his pen, still live. Then the time-stamped internal log of Derek's confrontation. Then the terminal marker indicating Derek's unauthorized exit from the crew hold. Last came a photo. Derek's illegal transmitter patch. He reviewed the message once. No errors. Then he hit send. It traveled through the encrypted portal, flagged as high priority, and triggered an automatic alert to the airline's Legal Ethics Review Committee, the Department of Aviation Oversight, and 2 embedded watchdog agencies Cale's company had helped place through reform partnerships. Derek didn't know he'd just tossed the match that lit the final fuse. Cale closed the laptop, slid it back into the bag, and leaned his head gently against the seat. The plane hummed on, peaceful to the unaware. But war had already begun in silent channels. The final line of the whistleblower submission blinked once on screen before vanishing into encrypted transmission. Flight 702 will not be forgotten. Neither will the hand you let rise. The attendant smirked, confident his attack would go unpunished, unaware that every witness, every legal document, and every countermeasure had already been prepared to strike back instantly. If you believe cruelty under privilege always folds when strategy meets authority, hit subscribe now, because justice never hesitates. Derek Morn thrashed against the restraints, his wrists bound with reinforced fabric straps as the aircraft began its controlled descent. His outburst minutes prior had rattled more than a few passengers, and Captain Marin Ryler had wasted no time making the call. Now, with the cabin quiet again, only the low hum of engines and the soft ding of the seatbelt sign filled the air. The tension was not gone, only compressed, like air in a sealed cabin holding its breath. Across row 2, Cale Vernick remained seated, upright, calm, but the muscles along his jaw were tight with silent pressure. He hadn't spoken since Derek's second approach, hadn't flinched when the crew restrained the unstable attendant. But now, with descent imminent, Cale rose. He stepped carefully into the aisle and walked forward toward the cockpit. The atmosphere shifted with every step, passengers watching him with a mix of concern and quiet admiration. The man who'd been grabbed, manhandled, humiliated, hadn't raised his voice once. Now he approached the captain with the same deliberation he used in boardrooms and tribunals. Cale reached into his suit pocket and produced a slim, matte black device, the voice-activated pen. "This," he said, holding it out to Captain Ryler, "is only part 1. The captain took it solemnly. No questions, no resistance. Just a silent nod, his expression the same as one might wear during a black box recovery. He turned the pen over in his fingers, the weight of its contents unspoken but unmistakable. "Understood," Ryler finally said, slipping it into his secure pocket. He tapped his headset. "Copy, Tower. Prepare for ground presence upon arrival. We have an active legal matter in play." High above the city of Sorenvale, the aircraft began to tilt slightly as flaps extended. From seat 2A, Cale returned slowly, the eyes of the cabin still on him. But this time, it wasn't fear that followed his movement. It was gravity. Presence. A man who had held back so the law could step forward. Behind him, Bram Cortell quietly finished his third call in under 15 minutes, speaking in clipped tones to Federal aviation monitors stationed at Sorenvale Terminal. "Yes, confirmed. Passenger still restrained. Physical contact confirmed. Surveillance corroborated. Yes, passenger is Dr. Cale Vernick. Copy that. We'll expect you at Gate 11B. Back on the ground, Calen Vernick was already a step ahead. The moment his brother had handed over the pen, the trigger for synchronized litigation was pulled. 5 legal representatives, each from a different branch of Valor Tech's in-house and external advisory network, sat in a circular conference room just across from the tarmac, their screens populated with contracts, timelines, footage, and real-time transcripts. At Calen's command, they had launched a full-spectrum suit against Aravel Airlines, complete with simultaneous claims: unlawful targeting of a registered passenger, mid-air physical assault by an airline employee, breach of contract under the pre-registered Clause 44, and, most explosively, interference with a federally protected compliance whistleblower protocol. Calen's fingers danced across the keys, cross-linking every report to Valor Tech's proprietary tracking algorithm, ensuring no metadata could be altered in the airline's favor. "We are not responding," he told the room. "We are defining." On board, the aircraft's wheels touched down with a low thunder. Cale's spine straightened with the jolt, but his expression never shifted. The captain's voice came over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Sorenvale. Please remain seated. We will be experiencing a brief procedural review prior to gate arrival. Thank you for your cooperation." The phrase was clinical, but those who'd watched the events unfold knew exactly what it meant. As the aircraft taxied toward its assigned terminal, a ripple of movement occurred outside. Emergency compliance officers, uniformed aviation observers, and plainclothes agents began to gather near Gate 11B. News of the incident had already leaked, thanks to at least 3 passengers uploading shaky but clear clips of the attack mid-flight. One video, less than 20 seconds long, showed Derek's hand on Cale's throat with crystal clarity. Another showed Cale's expression during the assault. No panic, no rage, just awareness. It had already been shared over 500,000 times by the time the wheels met the runway. Inside the cabin, Derek slumped quietly against the wall, eyes wide now with realization. He'd lost control, not just of the moment, but of the story. No crew member came to his defense. No apology was offered. Cale did not look at him. Instead, as the plane came to a stop, Cale stood once more. Not to rush off, not to escape the scene, but to take position near the forward exit, feet planted firmly. As the front door unlocked with a mechanical hiss, he turned slightly, just enough to face the aisle. Passengers began to file out, one by one. Some gave him a glance of gratitude, others a nod of solidarity. A few murmured soft, "Thank you," or simply paused long enough to register their support. Cale didn't speak. He didn't need to. He simply looked. Not at the crew, not at the cameras flashing just outside the threshold, but at every single passenger who passed him. Quietly, fully, eye to eye. That silent exchange, unspoken, unshaken, was louder than any statement. Across the terminal, just beyond the security glass, Kalen Vernick stood with arms crossed, watching through the pane. His phone buzzed as a legal advisor confirmed. The court had accepted the first 4 charges without objection. Derek's name was already trending, but not for the reasons he'd once bragged about in training lounges. Kalen leaned forward slightly as the aircraft door opened, catching a glimpse of his brother's still figure near the exit. And in a voice only the glass could hear, he whispered the words as if sealing them in law. "They tried to drag one brother down, but both of us stood up." The moment Cale Vernick stepped off Aravelle Flight 702, he wasn't guided toward baggage claim or immigration lanes like the others. Instead, 2 uniformed security agents in plain suits greeted him with clipped nods and silent gestures, leading him down a narrow corridor that bypassed the usual flow of terminal foot traffic. No one spoke as the footsteps echoed. The tension wasn't just palpable, it was tactical. At the end of the hallway, a frosted glass door slid open. Inside, the lighting was sterile, the air cold, and 4 men waited. At the center sat Kalen Vernick, already hunched over a set of printed documents, one hand resting on a thick manila folder, the other holding a stylus. To his right stood a stern-looking federal compliance officer in navy blue with silver trim. Beside him, a transportation ethics observer cross-checked a tablet. And at the far end, Valor Tech's lead litigation advisor, Darren Vask, stood with arms folded, eyes already scanning Cale for nonverbal cues. Cale didn't sit immediately. He handed over the pen recorder without a word. Kalen took it, nodded once, and plugged it into a secure terminal on the desk. Bram Cortell, who had deplaned quietly earlier, entered behind Cale and shut the door behind him with finality. "Playback started 2 minutes after initial contact," Kalen said, his voice tight but contained. "Multiple angles, cabin feeds, passenger clips." On the monitor, a frozen still frame flickered to life. Derek Morn's hand locked around Cale's throat, mid-drag, eyes wild, mouth half open, mid-shout. The image was time-stamped, geolocated, encrypted. "Footage already went viral," the ethics officer added. "We've confirmed 3 clips are circulating. 1 got picked up by a news desk in Norwin Bay." Cale remained standing. "That's not the real damage," he said. "It's what Bram just told me." All eyes shifted to Cortell. He took a step forward and spoke calmly but clearly. Derek Morn was previously assigned to a program called PBIP, Passenger Behavior Influence Program. Internal flagging of high-risk profiles for behavior modulation in flight. It was officially shut down after backlash from both unions and legal. But it's been operating again, quietly, selectively. "Revived illegally?" the officer asked. "Rebranded as cabin conduct simulations. Same tools, same intent. Derek was reassigned to test escalation under controlled variables." Cale's jaw clenched. "And I was the variable." Silence hovered for a moment until Kalen opened the manila file. "This," he said, sliding it across the table, "is a 73-page injunction, filed under emergency clause precedents. We're freezing every contract tied to Aravelle's compliance partners." He looked squarely at the officer. "Every subcontractor, every behavioral tool vendor, every data license issued under their cabin analytics division." The officer flipped through the first few pages, his brow tightening. "You're going after the entire chain?" "This isn't revenge," Kalen replied evenly. "It's leverage. We don't want retribution, we want reconstruction." The litigation advisor finally spoke. "We'll need precedent. You've just escalated this into federal procurement territory." "That's exactly where it belongs," Cale said, finally sitting. "Because if they tested it on me, they've tested it on others who couldn't speak." The monitor blinked again. Another frame loaded, Derek entering the flight last minute, badge number blurred, but the coded patch on his sleeve unmistakable. "They never expected we'd catch the sleeve," Kalen said, "or that I'd be watching when they tried to threaten him with a folded photo." As the room absorbed the gravity of the situation, Cale leaned back in his chair, his face unreadable. The compliance officer closed the file slowly, his tone shifting from skeptical to resolute. "Gentlemen," he said, "you didn't just catch a rogue agent. You may have just exposed the spine of a cover operation." Outside the frosted glass, the terminal's daily rhythm continued undisturbed. But inside, a storm had begun to take shape, one that would rattle every link in the airline's silent chain of power. And as Kalen quietly clicked the lock on the file, he repeated the sentence that would carry them into the next phase. "This isn't about revenge. It's about leverage." The headline hit before sunrise. Black CEO assaulted midair by flight attendant, federal lawsuit triggered by twin brother. It spread like wildfire across news banners, industry sites, and social media feeds, igniting a storm Aravel's crisis team hadn't prepared for. Every outlet recycled the same grainy image: Cale Vernick standing solemnly in the cabin aisle, holding the now infamous folded slip between his fingers, a blurry photo of his brother Kalen used as a warning. But it wasn't just a photo anymore. It had become a symbol. A line crossed, a test that backfired. At Valertech's legal command room, Kalen Vernick stood surrounded by glowing screens and murmuring analysts. He didn't blink. He had expected this exact sequence: leaks, speculation, a rush of shallow statements. He didn't plan to join the noise. He planned to weaponize it. "Push the logs," he ordered. Within 15 minutes, Valertech's internal legal unit issued a formal demand. Aravel's board was to deliver every crew reassignment log for the last 18 months within 24 hours. No exceptions, no redactions. Behind closed doors, executives panicked. Lawyers whispered, because buried in those reassignments were dozens of swaps, some routine, some quietly ordered by Derek's uncle, a senior compliance contractor with a history of skirting regulatory layers. He had replaced people, removed oversight, and now one of those swaps had dragged his family name into the spotlight. Cale, meanwhile, said nothing to reporters. No press conferences, no interviews. He walked through Sorenvale Terminal with calm, his face unreadable behind sunglasses. When asked for a comment, he offered only one gesture. He held up the same folded slip, creased, worn, unchanged. The photo of Kalen still visible in his grasp. That image went viral by nightfall. In Washington, the FAA convened a closed-door session and emerged with a temporary freeze on all Tier 3 behavioral monitoring programs nationwide. Public trust had wavered, and in a climate increasingly suspicious of AI-powered crew behavior metrics, the timing couldn't have been worse. But the next blow didn't come from Cale. It came from a report his brother commissioned through a third-party intelligence firm. The report revealed that Derek Morn's mid-flight reactivation had been greenlit by a shadow compliance officer, someone who no longer worked at Aravel. His login credentials were still active, but the man himself had quietly resigned 6 weeks earlier. No exit interview, no official handoff. Further investigation traced those credentials to a shell firm registered in Norwin Bay, an offshore compliance buffer long rumored to house questionable reinstatement channels for high-risk employees. It was there, hidden behind layers of proxy ownership, that the full manipulation came to light. Kalen slid the report across the table to Cale. "They brought him back through a company that doesn't even list itself as operational." Cale read through the pages slowly. The further he read, the quieter the room became. A few moments passed before he finally closed the file and looked at his brother. There was no anger in his voice, no pride, only a simple truth. "They built the entire test around one assumption, that I'd break when touched." The tribunal began with no delay. Cale stood in front of the panel, Not hunched, not hesitant, but composed like a man who had anticipated every move made against him. The courtroom was quiet, save for the soft mechanical whir of the overhead recorder and the occasional rustle of papers. His posture, the way he placed a hand calmly on the edge of the evidence table, suggested not a victim pleading for justice, but a strategist enacting it. He didn't wait for prompting. With a steady tone, he placed the first piece of evidence on the display monitor, security camera footage from row 3, clearly showing Derek Morin's hand closing around Cale's neck. Then came the pen, a small, innocuous recording device retrieved from his lapel. He set it down with deliberate care, like placing a chess piece mid-match. He nodded to the technician, and audio crackled to life. Derek's voice shouting, "Stop resisting," followed by silence, then Cale's voice replying, calm and damning, "You've made contact. That's federal assault." There were no gasps, just quiet tension, the kind that creeps in when a room realizes it underestimated someone. Cale didn't flinch as Aravel's lead attorney, Marcus Tellin, attempted to minimize the encounter. "An isolated lapse in judgment under high-pressure conditions," he said, flipping through a folder without eye contact. The defendant, Mr. Morin, acted out of mistaken protocol authority. The judge remained silent. Cale, however, stepped forward again. "Let me clarify," he said, lifting a sheaf of printed time logs. "This is a time-stamped transcript of flight data. Note the gap between when Derek was officially removed from the crew roster and when he was reinstated. Now, pair that with this." He raised another document, an authenticated behavior tracker with backdated reinstatement entries. "That's a falsified override from a now-defunct compliance server." Marcus's jaw tightened. He tried to interject, but Cale wasn't finished. He reached into his briefcase and produced a sealed envelope. Without dramatic flair, he handed it to the clerk. "This testimony comes from a former crew member," Cale said. "It outlines prior incidents involving Mr. Morin, unfiled reports, one involving physical contact with another black passenger on Flight Velen 408. All buried, all signed off by the same compliance officer, Mr. Morin's uncle." The silence in the room now turned into audible discomfort. The judge leaned forward, eyes narrowing. The clerk read the testimony aloud. The courtroom stirred when it reached the line. "I was told directly that Derek had backup in legal. We were warned not to escalate complaints, especially if they involved passengers flagged under behavioral suspicion categories." Calen stood at that moment. Tall and steady, his voice didn't rise, it simply filled the room with clarity. "This is no longer about one man grabbing another. This is about a system that kept those hands free." He didn't look at Derek, who now sat pale, eyes darting between the judge and the gallery. He looked directly at the judge. The judge tapped a finger against the bench, once, twice. Then he leaned back and said quietly, "No recess, no deliberation. We act now." He turned to the court officer. "I am ordering a federal review of Aravel's compliance contracting structure, effective immediately. Mr. Morin is to be remanded into federal custody pending trial for assault and unlawful behavioral targeting under dormant influence protocols." Gasps followed. Some in the gallery began whispering. Attorneys, observers, a few former passengers seated behind the railing. Cale remained still, his hands folded. His eyes didn't gloat. They studied. The judge's final words echoed with a tone that felt like a verdict beyond this room. "The moment you wrapped your hand around his neck, you placed this industry under a new lens." The room erupted into a standing ovation before Cale even reached the stage. 3 months had passed since the incident aboard Flight 702, but the impact had only grown. Cale Vernick walked calmly through the wide glass doors of the Sorenvale International Convention Center, no longer as just the architect of Valor Tech's AI compliance framework, but now the face of its reform movement. Beside him, Calen matched his pace, holding a sealed black case that carried more than presentation slides. It held the final rollout protocol for the Passenger Justice Initiative, the system they built under fire, one that now bore a name of its own, OraView. They didn't waste time with pleasantries. The lights dimmed, the audience fell silent, and Cale stood at the center of the same auditorium where, nearly a year earlier, he'd pitched predictive audit algorithms to investors with little more than hope and conviction. Today, he brought results. Behind him, a screen flickered to life with a live demonstration of OraView, a system that encrypted real-time crew interactions, categorized behavioral patterns, and stored compliance flags in triple-redundant logs shielded from crew access. "This isn't about surveillance," Cale said, his voice clear and steady. "It's about responsibility, with a chain of custody no one can erase." The audience of federal regulators, transportation executives, and legal observers took notes furiously. Some looked shaken, others looked defensive, but no one looked away. What few knew was that Aravel, the airline forced to adopt the system, had initially resisted until a court injunction made it mandatory. The ruling was quiet but absolute. A federal judge had reviewed all footage, all transcript data, and the now infamous crew patch Derek had worn, a marker once linked to the defunct behavioral monitoring subdivision, now banned. The judge called it a relic of coercion disguised as compliance. Derek Morn had been sentenced to 5 years. The verdict echoed not just through headlines but through boardrooms and terminals alike. Airlines scrambled to review their internal policies, fearful of being the next caught in Valertech's cascading litigation net. But Cale hadn't accepted any settlement. In a move that startled the legal world, he redirected all restitution funds toward independent third-party oversight, ensuring that OraView could not be diluted, sold, or absorbed into any one company's jurisdiction. To accept payment would be to sell silence, Cale had told Kalin weeks earlier, and silence is what started this. Kalin had agreed. That's why today he sat just off stage, cueing each slide of the demonstration with quiet precision. When it was time, he rose and approached the podium beside his brother. Together, they introduced OraView's most controversial feature, dual affirmation logging, a real-time mutual consent protocol between crew and passenger to record and timestamp interactions flagged as confrontational. The room murmured. Cale welcomed it. "Some fear it will lead to more lawsuits," he admitted. "But if we must fear anything, let it be the truth buried, not the truth preserved." The camera crew caught that line. It would be quoted across news channels by nightfall. After the launch concluded, a private post-event session was held in a reserved boardroom on the mezzanine floor. Inside, Cale, Kalin, their litigation strategist Eldrick Mairn, and a Department of Transportation representative reviewed the next rollout phases. Cale passed a list of domestic carriers that had expressed interest in voluntary adoption, some from pressure, others from conscience. The room paused when Eldrick noted that one of the firms Derek's uncle had consulted for had already shut down operations quietly last month. "No one wants their fingerprints near that program anymore," Eldrick said. Cale nodded, but his gaze drifted toward the case still lying on the table. It held the pen recorder, now archived, and a copy of the op-ed he'd just published under a reserved license. The title was simple: "Silence does not equal compliance." The piece was already trending in digital legal journals, and the quote from the closing paragraph had begun appearing across compliance blogs. "They tried to reduce me to a disruption. My brother reminded them I was a definition." Kalin closed the lid of the case and placed it back in the center of the table. There was one more act to close the chapter. That evening, back at their legal headquarters, Kalin stood in the war room alone. On the wall was a freshly mounted frame. Inside it, the folded note Derek had thrown on the plane, still creased, still bearing the photo of Kalin leaving their building the morning of the assault. Below it, he had placed a small brass plate etched with 6 words Cale had once whispered during the quiet aftermath. "Let them always remember, 2 necks, 1 verdict. The rooftop was quiet, except for the faint hum of a passing plane in the distance. Cale Vernick sat with his elbows resting on the iron rail, fingers interlocked, gaze fixed upward, not at the stars, but beyond them. The chair beside him creaked as Calen leaned back, arms crossed, the cool night air lifting the edge of his blazer. Between them on the weathered wooden table sat the folded slip of paper, the very one that once carried a silent threat. It was untouched, preserved, its crease still sharp from the day Derek Morn had thrown it at Cale midair, a relic of attempted intimidation, a symbol of what failed. "You ever think about that moment?" Calen asked quietly, his voice steady but distant, as if he'd rehearsed the question before daring to speak it. Cale didn't look over. His face remained composed, but his eyes darkened. "The grip?" he asked, knowing exactly what his brother meant. Calen gave a small nod. Cale exhaled slowly, his breath misting in the crisp air. He tapped a finger once against the table's edge, a silent habit he'd developed after tense boardroom sessions. "I remember the sound before it happened," he said finally. Not the shout, the click, his belt buckle when he leaned in. Calen remained still, watching Cale, not as a strategist, not as a CEO, but as his twin. The one man who had seen both the rise and the rupture and understood that silence could be louder than retaliation. "Every part of me wanted to react," Cale continued, his voice low. "Instinct told me to pull back, defend myself, break the grip, but something colder, something trained, held me still, not out of fear, out of calculation." There was a pause, not of hesitation, but of reverence for what followed. Cale slowly turned his head, meeting his brother's eyes. "Because if I moved, they'd say it was mutual. If I flinched, I'd lose the angle. If I raised my voice, I'd drown the footage." Calen's jaw tightened. "And instead," he said, "you watched him tighten his hand, knowing that every second was becoming evidence." Cale nodded. "And you made it war the second I let go." Silence stretched between them, broken only by the faint crackle of leaves stirring on the rooftop tiles. The folded note fluttered slightly, catching a breeze but staying in place. Calen reached out, pressing it flat with his palm. His voice dropped, tinged with a whisper of regret. "I saw it live, Cale. Every frame. I wasn't on that plane, but I've replayed it like I was. And I still ask myself, if I were you, would I have stayed that still?" Cale didn't answer immediately. He stood, slowly, and walked to the edge of the rooftop, gazing out at the neighborhood where they'd grown up, the same streets where they'd raced bikes, fixed old radios, and argued over whose turn it was to carry their father's briefcase to the library. All the lessons that had shaped them, restraint, clarity, consequence, seemed to echo louder now. "You know the truth?" Cale said, his back still to Calen. "He didn't grab me because I was a threat. He grabbed me because he thought I wasn't. He thought silence meant surrender, that I was just a name on a seat manifest with no weight behind it." Cale turned, the rooftop light casting a halo behind him. "But when you stood up, when the footage hit, when the claws activated, that's when he realized whose throat he touched." Calen rose too, walking to stand beside him, the twin silhouettes aligned like a single figure split in two. He rested a hand on Kyle's shoulder. "They tried to isolate you, but they forgot who you were connected to." A beat passed, then another. Cale's lips curved, not in triumph, but in quiet peace. "Do I regret not fighting back?" He echoed the original question, his voice calm now, like a final ruling had been passed. "No, because I let the world watch them do it, and then watched us rewrite the rules." The rooftop fell quiet again, and on the table behind them, the folded note remained, creased but untouched, beside a small handwritten line only Cale could have written, the ink faded but resolute. "They grabbed the wrong man's throat." The twin brother stepped forward, filing the lawsuit and holding the crew accountable, leaving the cabin stunned and the aggressor powerless. If you believe real authority combines preparation, protection, and decisive action, subscribe now because justice always lands first. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It highlights abuse of authority, prejudice, and the power of strategic action and accountability in confronting wrongdoing. Its purpose is to raise awareness, inspire empathy, and encourage conversations about equality, justice, and treating every passenger with dignity and respect.